Hello. So this is my video for Introduction to Sociology on Social Psychology. So you guys just finished doing the discussion board on the Indian permaculture movement as a social movement, and you guys did a good job at analyzing it. One thing that I think comes out in your guys' posts is the theme of which is a central theme that we talked about when it came to like resource management. It's sort of like how is this a resource mobilization theory, right? How is this social movement organizationally set up, and how does that have to do with things, particularly the success of the movement? And I saw that a lot with things like flexibility, right? You guys' discussion of flexibility. So for today, what I'd like to mostly focus on is social psychology, and particularly sort of setting up for that the article on the sound of stigmatization that you guys are going to be posting about this week. So social psychology has its origins as we use the term in sociology. Particularly social psychology and sociology denote something called symbolic interactionism, which is mostly a theory about how is it that we as human beings interact, and what makes that form of interaction possible. It has its foundations in somebody by the name of George Herbert Mead. And to get us thinking about social psychology and George Herbert Mead, I'd like to take an example of his discussion of a symbolic interaction versus what he would call a conversation of gesture. So for us to get this in mind, let's think about things like how a dog would interact with each other. I spend more time than I'd probably like to admit at the dog park walking my dog. My dog's actually right here beneath me right now, even though you can't see him in the camera shot. So when two dogs, they come up to each other, one will posture, right, and the other will respond to that, right? So we could think about the first dog provides a stimulus, right, the posturing. The second dog is either going to posture in return or cower, right? It's going to respond. That response becomes a stimulus that will determine how the other dog acts. It's all very pre-prescribed. At no point does the dog sit there and pause it. If I do this, this is what the other dog's going to do, according to George Herbert Mead. We can contest that if we want to. But according to George Herbert Mead, at no point does the dog factor in how its behavior affects its environment. In other words, the dog doesn't exist with a sort of like self-aware consciousness of itself in the world and how it acts. Very different for human beings. Human beings can communicate with a conversation of gesture. I think of something like, people posturing before a bar fight would be a conversation of gesture. People trying to intimidate one another. The person might not even really be thinking about, if I do this, this is what's going to happen, right? But it becomes a pure gesture. And according to George Herbert Mead, we are possible of that form of communication. But most of our communication happens through the utilization of symbols, which works very differently, in particular language. So you can think about like when we speak, we often are trying to call out something specific in our audience. So when I say something, I think about what is it that so-and-so, right, the person I'm speaking is going to think of me, right? Initially this starts as a skill for George Herbert Mead with just a few people. You might be able to posit what your parents will think of you. If I do X, Y, and Z, what will my parents think of me? This then gets expanded into sort of what he would call roles. And we learn roles. And when you think about children, at a certain point children start pretending to be other things, right? And what they're essentially doing is they're putting on a role, right? They're thinking about, how is this form of other, how is this sort of person going to react to me if I do something, right? How are they going to react in a given situation? And then they perform that, right? And essentially a skill that we develop. Understanding, being empathetic to what other people are going to see. And so this slow gained ability, right, through positing other people for George Herbert Mead is what leads us to have a very different form of interaction. So like you can think about, a heightened version of this would be something like a job interview, or even like what I did to prepare for this, where literally I sat down and I took a bunch of notes, and I literally thought about how is it that I can communicate this content to these people. I posited you guys in my head individually. I also posited, sort of my generalized student, the role of student, and thought about what students in the past have understood or not understood, and I do this almost automatically, and then I get before you and then I try to communicate, right? And then you're going to take this, and then, if this was an ideal world, you would then respond back to me in various ways in the moment, but, even on the symbolic interaction of you typing and posting onto a screen, you're taking the things I've said and the things you've read, and then when you write, you're thinking of how I'm going to react, how the other students are going to react to the words you post, right? So the foundation, if we were to step back, the foundation of social psychology, or what it means to do social psychology, is all about how we internalize various symbols which allow us to be reflexive and think about our actions in the world. So for George Herbert Mead, every single role you have, every single role you understand other people as having, comes from an act of internalization. You weren't born with it. And then to some degree, that's what makes the conversation of gesture different. Dogs just have instinct, according to George Herbert Mead. They have nothing else. So they're simply providing stimulus for one another, right? So it's this sort of instinctually driven physical interaction. For human beings, it works very differently because we have this possibility of internalizing. Where does this possibility come from? For George Herbert Mead, it comes from something he calls the phases of self. Phases of self work the same as language. You have an I and you have a me. And so if you think in English, as well as in most European languages, you have this distinction of are you referring to yourself as an object to others, me? Or are you referring to yourself as acting, I? I went to the grocery store and so saw me pick up a gallon of milk, right? I and me. Active phase of self, I. Passive phase of self, me. So where, to some degree, on the basis of instinct, animals, according to Mead, only have an active phase of self. They only have the actor, right? Human beings have, through their superior use of language and ability to think, an ability to internalize, right? The me. And so this is born for George Herbert Mead as the acquisition of one of our first symbols, our own name. We learn to see ourselves as an object because people call us things, either our actual name, Nick, John, Mary, etc., right? Or as just the different things that people call a young child, baby, right? So these become symbols, right, that denote us. And by learning the symbol of us, we learn, right, this passive phase of self. So for George Herbert Mead, we're always playing these various internalized roles. So that's one version of social psychology. I'm going to provide you with a second one because it's significant for the article you're reading, which is Erving Goffman. Erving Goffman starts something called dramaturgical analysis. Think theater, drama. And like George Herbert Mead, Goffman largely sees us as the performer of roles, but it works a little bit differently. He wants to use this sort of extended drama metaphor for understanding how individuals interact with other people and the society around them. And to give you an example of how this would work, you don't wear clothes, you instead construct costumes. The costumes denote the roles that you belong to. So we have an understanding that certain people forming certain roles like will dress in certain ways. So this is one of the reasons, like, if you ever feel awkward when you're in public, you know, dress for something else. Like if you go and exercise and you work out, and then I feel like this, right? Like, you know, if I'm like out for a jog and then I like get in the car and run up to Walmart and run into a student, I feel really awkward about that, right? Why is that? It's because, you know, athletic shorts and a t-shirt are not the right performative wear, right? It doesn't denote the role. When I'm the role of exerciser, when I'm playing the role of exerciser, it works just fine as a costume, right? But as the role of professor, it does not work. You know, so you move between different characters that you're playing. Another way to put it is, for Mead, you have a very solid sense of self, this internalized role. For Goffman, you have sort of this piecemealed series of roles, none of which are really you, and you're playing them, right? So you have a costume, you have props, you have lines, right? Things that you can think about, like if you ever think about what you're going to say in given situations in your day, essentially what you're doing for Goffman is you're sort of running lines, you're practicing for a role. This gets us to probably the most important dramaturgical term he uses, front stage and backstage. So the distinction between front stage and backstage is the distinction between the space in which the role is made and the space in which you perform the role. And once again, this corresponds to a theater, right? Front stage is what you see the actors doing on the stage, right? Backstage is all the things that go into that you never see. And then essentially we do the same things. When we prepare for our day-to-day roles in everyday life, we construct them in a backstage where nobody sees them. Once again, if you think of a heightened version of this, you can think of a job interview, right? You prepare what you're going to wear in advance, you think about the questions they're going to ask you, you think about the responses you're going to give to them, right? A lot of meticulous care is put into preparing for it. And then you go out, and then you play the role of the model employee, the person you should hire. And the success at which you play that role or don't play that role will largely determine whether you get the job, right? So there's actually a skill that gets developed here. So we're all sort of like trying to convince each other to allow us to play our various roles. This is where the idea of stigma comes in. So for Erving Goffman, stigma is essentially are essentially negative roles that we're forced to play that we don't want to. And then, how is it that we separate ourselves from stigmatized roles? How is it that we remove them? Our performance, rather than trying to get them, to gain them, right, to hold up to them, is instead trying to negate them, throw them away, get out of them. And so in various roles, when you try to like avoid stigma, you try to pass. And in passing, you preserve a positive concept of self, right? Meaning that you if you successfully pass off your stigmas, you can feel better about yourselves than other groups of people, right? People who have that stigma more strongly. I read a great article not that long ago on alcoholics. It was a study done where the person doing this study would go to a bar every morning. This was done in Scandinavia. And he would go to a bar every morning and just engage in conversation with people who are patrons there. So people who drink at 9 o'clock in the morning. So in going here, he records essentially like all the language and ways of talking about themselves that the alcoholics use to downplay, right? The fact that they are at a bar drinking beer and getting drunk at 9 in the morning. Comparing themselves to, other bars and patrons of other bars that are worse drinkers than them, talking about that they plan on getting sober soon, right? Bragging about things like drinking water or coffee in between drinks. All these ways of sort of throwing off the negative stigma of being an alcoholic, whether they're functional or not, right? Whether they're a functional alcoholic with a job or whether they are an alcoholic that can't function in everyday life, right? So these various strategies that they use. The stigma literature is all about that. It's about the preservation of self, positive understandings of who we are. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of social psychology as it's practiced in sociology. Or some of the major theories of it. Okay, this is our last video, guys. So that'll round out. If you guys have questions as you move forward, let me know. One thing, the final is due May 8th. So it's due at 11:59, like always. But it'll be due May 8th. I will not be granting any extensions for the finals. The reason why is it increases time. Which brings me to another question I got. I had a few people email me about when the term paper grades are going to be posted. I haven't graded them yet, and it's largely because there's been so many people with internet issues or family issues or things that have pushed off the term paper. As of Friday, I only had about half. So so I'm giving people some extra time. I have some extensions out. I've granted some extensions. I'm kind of waiting for them to come back in. The more I can grade all of them at once, the more accurate the grade will be. So I'll make comparisons, see where everyone's doing. Because if people together don't do very well on something or didn't follow a specific instruction, I know then it's me or it's the situation and it's not them. So I really want to grade them next to each other so that I can really give a fair grading. I try to do that in general, but normally I don't grant very many extensions. So this is a rare circumstance. So thank you for your patience. I'm hoping in a couple of days I'll do it, and then you get your term paper grades. So other than that, final May 8th. If you want me to look over anything beforehand, or if you have questions, let me know. But other than that, thank you guys for. I really enjoyed the first half of the semester where I got to see all of you. When we're back on campus, feel free to stop in my office at Cray Seaburger anytime. If you need anything in the interim, let me know. Otherwise, have a good summer, and stay safe, and hopefully we'll all be back out in the world soon. So, thank you guys. Bye.